For this tutorial series, I'm going to show how to use custom particles as an alpha matte reveal to get that painted on look like you see in the Sherlock credit sequence and in a lot of motion graphics today. We'll be covering green screen removal, textures, blending modes, custom particles, and alpha matte reveals for this. To get that painted in look from the Sherlock title sequence that's used a lot these days, you could use video footage, photos, motion graphics, whatever you want. So I'm going to start with this video. I'm going to drag it onto my new composition button right down here so that it matches up to where I want it. Now, for this effect to look its best, clearly I'm going to want to remove the green screen. I'm going to use key light, click the green near me, change from final result to screen matte, and I'm going to want pure white and pure black. What's pure white will be seen, what's pure black will be masked out. And I will use screen matte and I will change the black and the white until I get pure black and pure white. And then I'll go back to final result. There's some clips over here I'm going to need to mask out. To mask, you make sure you have the layer selected and use any of the shape tools or the pen tool. And you've got two options. There's add or subtract. Whatever's in this mask, if I have it add, you'll only see what's inside the mask. If I change to subtract, it'll subtract whatever's inside the mask. I'm going to duplicate this layer by pressing Ctrl D. And I'm going to turn off the extra sound layer. On the one beneath it, I'm going to turn off the effect by clicking the FX icon up here at the top. What is going to happen is I'm going to use the top layer that's already masked out as an alpha matte. So I'm in my switches. To get out of switches, I click switches and modes. Now I've got my mattes and I can choose alpha matte. Remember the layer that's on top, it's like you want a mask to go over your face. So what I'm using as that mask shape goes on top of the layer that will be masked out. So on the bottom layer I choose alpha matte and now I've got my alpha matte. And as you can see there's some green fringing going on. I'm going to pick a texture right here. I'll put it underneath. It'll help me see better. And I'm also going to be using it in my artwork anyway. So I'm going to refine this green screen. I'm going to click on the top one that has the green screen. Let's see what happens if I increase the gain. So you can see it's starting to eat away at the camera right there. So I don't want that to happen. Use screen matte. And I want to pay attention to my skin colors when I'm doing this. So I'll try source, hard color, soft color. I think source is sort of looking the best. Now let's try the clip white. That's doing it pretty good too, but it's also at the same time eating away at some of the camera strap. Now another thing I can do is I can shrink or grow my mask. I'm going to shrink it a little bit and I'll soften up the edges a little as well. Now I'll increase the screen gain a little bit. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now I've got a much better looking screen. Since I have two layers, I want to make this easier on myself. I'm going to select both of them, right click, pre-compose, move all attributes. I'll call this me, and then you always want to move all attributes into a new composition. I'm going to throw hue saturation on this, and I'm going to desaturate the green of that just to hide some of that. If I did not pre-compose this, then it would have messed up the green screening behind it. This is the first part. I've got the artwork that I want to reveal in that Sherlock fashion with the paint splotches painting it in. Next, we're going to reveal it with a particle system. Now, I've got two different types of paint splotches. Since I'm using this as an alpha matte, I've got one that's pure black with some alpha around it. If I wanted to use a luma matte, I'd have something with more tonal range. Remember, luma mattes will go off of values between white and black or shades of that, and it will reveal the transparency. So not only would it paint it on, but you'd have a transparency, like faded look if that's what you wanted. But as I said, I'm going for alpha. So I've got the image and I've got what I'm going to use in my particle. I'm going to click the eyeball icon to hide that paint. I'm going to need a new solid for my particles, and I'll call this layer particles. It's going to fit the screen. I'm going to make it black just for the fun of it. You can always click make comp size if you needed to. Now I'm going to throw my effect in there. And I'm going to want particle world. Remember, particle world is the only 3D particle system. I'm going to keep my grid on for this. And I'm going to go down to extra, effect camera. Now, as you'll see, it's the x-axis I'm going to want to rotate. This particle system is going downward. I want it to go out towards the camera. Just showing you this is how the different axes affect the particle system. Mine will be X. See, if I go this way, this is away from the camera, and going in this direction is towards the camera. So I'm going to want -90. Now it's facing the camera. So I've got my particles going in the right direction, and I'm just going to hide me so it speeds up, and I'll hide the layer behind it. So now I just figure out which type of physics engine I want for this animation. I'm going to try cone access for this. Now remember, velocity is how far away the particles will travel and also how they stick together. I'm going to want them to be lumped fairly close together for this. Gravity will be up or down, and you see how it's also affecting this since I turned it. I'm going to give it a little less gravity so they stick together. Resistance will also affect how strong the engine is, and it affects this. I don't want any extra for this. So I sort of have my motion. I'm going to dial it in a little bit more, but then I'm going to want my radius to change. Remember this X, Y, and Z. As we can see, this is going backwards, which is not what I want. Let's try explosive. Now it's going forward. That's working better for me. Okay, so I roughly have the motion. I'm going to dial it in by adding my particle now. So under particle, I'm going to choose texture faded disk so that they blend together pretty smoothly. And I'll twirl down texture. Oh, before I do that, I'm going to turn back on my texture so I can see better. Now remember, to avoid trouble down the road, whatever you're using as your custom particle, you should precompose. So I'm going to precompose this, move all attributes to new composition. So now when I choose that, it should respond better. So I've got my particle in, and now let's dial in the motion. The birth size, I'm going to want it to be a little bit smaller as it's born and get bigger as it dies so that it fills in the screen better. Give it full size variation, maximum opacity 100. Now, my opacity map, this means it's fading on and fading off. Do I want it to fade on and fade off? Let's see how that affects it. I just mouse over it and fill it in with my pen. And I like it better as it is not fading on or off. That's just me. I'm going to reduce my preview resolution so I can work faster. The negative velocity was making everything move inward. I do not want that. I shorten the longevity of them so the particles will fill in faster. Now at this point, I'm going to turn off my grid just so I can see everything better. I'm adjusting my birth rate and my longevity to make the effect draw on slower for more subtlety. So I have my particles moving the way that I want them to, like an ink blot that's spreading out across the screen. So to get this look, I use these settings. I lowered the longevity and increased the birth rate. I shrunk the radius of the particle system, used explosive from the physics engine with a lower velocity so that they'd stick together, changed the gravity, increased the resistance so the particles would stick together. Here's where I've got my particle system of what I'm using. I have a small birth size with a larger depth size so that they grow over time with maximum opacity. I changed my opacity map. Remember, you mouse over and you draw how you want it so that it does not fade off or fade on. I set my birth and death color to white so that I use the actual color of the particle. I'm using composite because I want the particles to stack together and have density. I do not want this to be a light effect. In extras, I have this rotated -90 so it's going towards the camera. And that's about it for my settings. So I've got my particle system, I've got a texture for the background for some interest, and I've got some footage of me. Now, the bare minimum for this effect to work. So I've got the particles above me, and I set the me layer to an alpha matte. And as you see, I get that painted on look from the particles. Now this is the basic step. If you want to do it this way, this is how you can do it. But to kick your design up a notch, I'm going to turn off my alpha matte. The fancy way of doing this is you could duplicate this layer, change your contrast and curves so that you paint in first like a maximum contrast, then a mid contrast, and then the final of this. And also, if I want to keep the color, sure, but let's see what happens if I change my blending mode of me with this texture. If I try, let's see what happens if I desaturate this entire layer. So now I've got a grayscale image. Okay, so I've got the texture in the background, and I changed the blending mode of this to an overlay, just to get more of like a drawn on to a textured piece of paper look. Now, I'm going to select the clip of me, and I'm going to press Control D to duplicate it twice. I'm going to hide the two beneath it and work off the top one. This one is going to be my high contrast image. I'll play around with my curves. And you can do this with still photos too. So I've got a very faint image of myself. That's the top one. The middle one, I'll put curves on the middle one. And I'm going to turn off the extra sound icons because I'm not going to want that. I'm going to just adjust the midtones a little bit. So I've got a faint, then a little bit stronger. And then the bottom one, this one's a little too dark for my liking, so I'm going to just change it slightly. So I'm going to have the particles paint on the highlight faded one first. I'm going to duplicate my particle layer, and then it's going to paint on the midtone one, duplicate my particle layers again by pressing Control or Command D, and then it'll paint on the final one. So to have these paint on, I'm going to just move them down in time. Let's just say 1 second each. So this one, I'm going to move the playhead to 1 second, and I'm going to press the bracket by the letter P. Then we'll go 1 second later, a little bit more than a second. Select the next one and press the bracket by the P. So the animation is offset. This is revealing this one. So this top one will paint on the highlights. So I'm going to get this texture. I'm going to duplicate it 3 times. So the first one, I'm going to group with this. I've got these two together, and I'm going to precompose them. I'll call this one 01 fade in. I'm doing this because I used a blending mode and the texture, so I want to keep them together. So now I'm going to do this to the middle one. I've got the texture and that beneath it. I'm going to precompose. I'll call this 02 fade in, precompose, move all attributes to new composition. Then I'll get the third one. It's already beneath me. Precompose those two together. 03 fade in, move all attributes to new composition. So now I've got, inside this, I've got the keyed out me plus this to keep the blending mode together as I paint on. And I've got the texture in the background so that as it's painting on, there's still something there. So it's all going to line up. Same texture, same images. So I'm going to click the eyeball icon to turn these on. Turn off my extra sound. And remember, the particles on top are going to reveal. So they go on top. What's beneath, change to an alpha matte. Again, I'm going to change this to an alpha matte. And then the final one, I'll change the me layer to an alpha matte. I had my layers in the wrong order. So I put the first fade on the bottom, the second one above it, and the third one above that. And this is just where my particles are right here. And as you can see, first the highlights come on, then the midtones start kicking in. As I go further, then the final darker image kicks on. So this adds visual interest by having the image come on in 3 separate ways with offsetting how each layer comes in with this reveal. And last but not least, if I want to tint this whole thing, I could throw a solid over top and change the blending mode. So I throw a tan solid over top of everything. And I'll use a color blending mode And to get the color the way I want it to, I could always change it, layer, solid settings, and then fix the color over here. That's one way of doing it. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. Or I can add curves and fix it over here and get a more real-time, faster display of it. So now that we've got the initial design working, let's push our idea a little bit further. If you want to slow down or speed up your particle systems, you can simply find the particle layer, right-click, and go time stretch. When you're using time stretch, look at the duration of your layer. Like this is 11 seconds, 22 frames. So if I make this 200, I slowed it down to half the speed it was before, because now it's doubled. Whereas if I make it 50, you see it's half the speed, so that means I sped it up 200%. So just for the fun of it, I'm going to slow all of them down to half speed so that they're coming out even slower. Now, two things you can do to add some interest. I've got the particle layer duplicated. It's the same thing. I can simply, so I'm going to turn off all my alpha mats to speed this up. And I'm going to hide all the layers that I'm not working on. So I've got just my particle system again. One way to add some real nice interest is each particle system that's revealing the different part, like the shadows, the midtones, the highlights. You could have it come in a different direction or with a different particle engine. Like if I chose and then I moved my particle system by changing the position up here. So that it comes in. I could also go to my extras and change the rotation of it. So say I want it to come in from an angle at the bottom or the top of where I'm going to be at. And remember, when you're rotating your X, Y, and Z, that's going to affect your X, Y, and Z for your particle system. So just pay attention to that. And this is not going as far as I'd like it to, so I could adjust the radius. Now remember, since I rotated it, it's going to affect. There we go. Now it's going the way I want it to. I don't want it to cover the full screen. Just add some interest. I'm going to adjust the birth rate and the longevity of this as well, and also affect the gravity of it. So this particle system is coming in different from the initial one, and I will change the midtone one a little bit. Let's go to the extra for that. Adjust the producer location for it. Let's have this one come in from the bottom a little bit more. So now I've got motion coming from the center, the top, and the bottom. And I'll turn back on my alpha mats. And you can already see this affecting the animation in a different fashion. Now that things are coming in from different directions with different particle engines, it'll reveal the animation. I changed the particle system for the last drawing, the one with the most detail. To get this look, I chose fire for my animation, for my physics animation. I increased the birth rate and decreased the longevity. I changed the position of the particle system as well as the radius, altered the velocity and the resistance, as well as the gravity. These are the settings I changed for my extra so that it's coming out differently. And like I said, I changed the particle release so it's more of an explosion of particles. And that's how I altered the particle system to get this effect, which when I turn on the final draw in, this is how it's now going to draw on in a downward fashion. The midtones are now going to animate on from the bottom in this fashion. These are the settings I changed for that. There's a longer longevity, and you can see how I altered the producer and the radius. This is explosive. I have a much lower velocity to keep the particles together. Less of a resistance than the top one. And here's where I changed my effect camera. I did not hold the particle release. Let me adjust that particle release a little bit. Give it a little bit more of an explosive look to it. Have them stick together. And remember, you always turn off your alpha matte to retest it, to like reload it. So I just turned it back on. And that's how that one is drawing on. So when I combine that with the top, I'm going to turn off that particle system. The alpha matte, turn it back on. So now the motion we've got is that draw on. And since this is the full reveal, I'm going to slide this down further in my timeline so that you see the midtones come in and then the top ones coming in as well. This midtone, I'm going to adjust this curve a little bit more, brighten it up so there's a little bit more difference between that and the final result as it draws in. So it's got a little bit more detail to it. So the final one, I'm going to open, darken it a bit so that there's more contrast between the two shots. And I'm going to keep the look of my initial particles that I'd had. Turn off that alpha matte, turn it back on, so that those come out from the center. Then the midtones are going to come up from the bottom, and then the final particles are going to come in from the top. I'll have that come over from the side some more. I just moved it over to the left so that you could see them come in and fill in the space better. So I've got more contrast here and there to get more of a unique look. So that's the first way of pushing the design, by altering your particle systems, where they're coming in, the direction, the speed, and offsetting them. Now, I'm going to save frequently, save often. The final step I'm going to do is I'm going to add an adjustment layer. To do that, you could right-click in the timeline where there's some space and choose New Adjustment Layer, or you could go up to the top and go Layer, New Adjustment Layer. Just make sure you have your timeline sequence selected. I'm going to put this below my color, and for this, I'm going to do the transform effect on it. And you say, well, why are you putting the transform effect on here? Because this way I can affect everything beneath it. So if I want to give a little bit of an imaginary camera movement, I could do a little bit of the Ken Burns by changing the scale, rotation, and position to give this even more interest. So I'm going to go to where my animation ends, like right about here. I'll let it draw on for the final second. And I'll do rotation, scale, and position. So I've set a keyframe for where I want it to end, and then I'm going to work backwards, go back to the beginning of the animation, and I'll let it draw on a little bit so I can see what's going on. Now that I can see what's going on, I'll make my changes and then move the keyframes. You'll see. So if I add a little bit, change the rotation and the position, so I'm going to turn off my texture because I'm going to want it to not affect that. I'll select everything above it plus the adjustment layer up first. I'm going to change my keyframe. So I press the U key. I'm going to slide these to the beginning. I'm going to select all of them. I changed my mind about this type. I'm going to cut it out of my final scene. Cut it out again. I'm going to paste it into here where my final image is going to be revealed. And I'll have it start right here after I rotate past it. So I'm going to hold down Option or Alt and hit the bracket by the P key to trim the layer to where the playhead is. Then when I go back to my final movie, it'll start to animate on as that particle system moves past it. So now you can use that as a credit reveal. So we came up with our custom particle system to reveal this, and then we split the image into three different things, like a high contrast, more of a midtones, and then the shadows, so that they're coming in at different times, and then used that reveal from the shadows to draw on the text. And we also used an adjustment layer to animate the scale, position, and rotation of the animation to add some interest to it as well.